All right, our second topic this week. We've been seeing pop up from time to time, and this is something that goes back to the late 1800s, but just the efforts to retell the history of the Civil War and the conflict that led up to it, and then the why the South seceded and so forth, formed the Confederacy. The traditional understanding and kind of the baseline understanding has always been that this was primarily about slavery and maintaining the institution of slavery, spreading the institution of slavery, but going back even to the Daughters of the Confederacy, and then even continuing to this day with like Prager University and all this other stuff, there's been efforts to throw doubt on that and to say, oh, it was about all this other stuff and states' rights or, economic, differences and all this other stuff. And this is in contrast, really, or in direct opposition to the contemporary writings of the people who led the Confederacy, by the way. But nonetheless, I wanted to throw it to you and kind of just address this issue head on, and not just what is going on, but the why, So why do you think there has been a persistent effort, amongst people who either sympathize with the South or relate to the South, or maybe, consider themselves kind of the descendants of the Confederacy and so forth, to make the Civil War about something other than slavery?
All right. So I'm going to draw a line from kind of those who are true descendants of Southern Confederates, who can trace their lineage in America to prior to 1865, which is not that many people at this point in our nation's story. Because you had about 100 million Europeans immigrate to the United States from about 1880 to, now, let's call it the 1950s. Let's say that it's the people who came here who now have offspring that are Americans. So let's separate the kind of cultural meme for a lot of people today to support maybe Confederate ideas or to think that, the history was different, that a lot of them aren't real descendants of people that actually fought in the Civil War that lived in the South prior to the 1860s. So let me talk about those people that do share a true heritage and lineage to Southern Confederate states. Because I was thinking about things like the way that the German nation reacted after World War I. They were one of the causes of the war, and they lost, right? And then they had to create a myth that turned into, what happened in the 30s. And the myth was that they were the victims, that everyone else, France and England and the United States were all the big bad guys, right? And the Japanese, the same thing. After the war, they're trying to cover up all the atrocities they did to the Chinese, for example. And they become the victims, right? And they make movies like Godzilla because it was, everyone else was bad and attacked them. So I think that if we look at things that happened within the decades after the Civil War, let's say from myths and propaganda like the Lost Cause, all the way to media events like Birth of a Nation, the famous movie in 1915, there was a narrative created after the Civil War that the South was the victim of Northern aggression. Yeah. And there's people today that still call it the War of Northern Aggression. And just like we see in today's...
like not tongue in cheek.
Yeah, they really believe it. Yeah. And just like we see in today's, even to some of today's culture wars, right? People that instigate certain behaviors, right? Once those behaviors don't play out the way they were planned, then maybe they kind of lost their quote unquote battle, then they become the victim and they try and change the narrative. So I think there's part of that. I think there's also just some people are just racist, right? And they don't know. Maybe they're not comfortable expressing it. But if that's because that gives a they're not comfortable to express it that way. Like they probably think that it's too harsh to say I agree with everything Alexander Stevens said in the Cornerstone speech. So emotionally, whether they're conscious of this or not, I think this is more of a subconscious thing. Because I think the people that are consciously racist and are okay with it are the ones that say, yeah, I think blacks like James and Tunde are inferior to me. And to me, I'm like, okay, that's honest. I can deal with that. I don't have to agree with it, but at least we can now have a conversation and know where we stand. I think it's people need these emotional off ramps, and there's enough people that want to give it to them and say, oh, it wasn't about this or that. It was about something else. Well, I think that's it. It's that simple.
To me, the answer is embedded in the question. And you danced around it, but I will just come out and say it in the sense that when after these world events, oftentimes people like to create or hold on to kind of what's their story. They either create a myth or if there's enough reality to it. Like for World War II in the United States and Pearl Harbor, they didn't have to create a myth. It was just like, but that's the thing. Like, hey, we were not, like all about it, but then we got attacked and then people declared war on us and then we went at it and we didn't start it, but we finished it. So the American myth for World War II, they didn't have to create one. It kind of fit. But it plainly that the people that are doing this don't think that slavery and white supremacy are a noble enough cause to build their myth around. Like, they just don't think it is. They don't think that they can sell that to the masses and say, hey, that you should have warm feelings about the Confederacy because this is what they stood for, and they ended up losing, but it still was a noble cause. Like, they just don't think it's a good enough cause. And so from a perception standpoint, and I mean, they think that more people are, and I think this is correct, that people are decent people. And if that's what you say your cause is about, then you're going to turn off a lot of people with that. Again, despite the fact what the leaders of the Confederacy at the time said in contemporary. So they create this other thing, to kind of say, okay, and this is you can get it from the Daughters of the Confederacy because they would want to kind of, I look at my dad or my uncles or whatever as part of some, again, they don't think slavery is a noble enough cause, at least that you can sell to the public. So, I want to do that. The more interesting thing is the people now, when we're 150 years, 160 years removed, and, because they don't have any, even if you're a descendant, you don't have a direct connection to that. Like, your self-worth and your kind of presentation in society isn't affected based on, that was that's a granddaughter of the Confederate, or that's a son of, like you're not, that doesn't follow you around wherever you go, So it's very revealing though on what they really think about the nature of what the Confederacy did stand for, that they feel the need to obscure that and make it about something. Okay, well, what does sell? What can we get people behind? Oh yeah, Northern aggression or economic stuff, or whatever you come up with these these tropes that you think you can get people behind. And so to me, it is revealing. It reveals what they really think about that stuff. More so, they themselves, as you said, may be okay with that, but what they think they can sell to and try to bring more people over and have sympathy like they do for the cause, so to speak.
And it's interesting too. He says here, because he basically this is really interesting to me about American history, because the Confederates called out the founding fathers like Washington and Jefferson as woke in today's term. Yeah. And he says here again, and quote, I admitted that the fathers, both of the North and South, who framed the old Constitution, because that's what they called the American Constitution, they had their new Confederate Constitution, or Constitution of the Confederacy, while recognizing existing slavery and guaranteeing its continuance under the Constitution so long as the states should severally see fit to tolerate its limits, were perhaps opposed to the principle. And he cited that in his original speech, where he basically was saying, like, hey, those founders were too squishy because they didn't want to go all the way and put this stuff really in there permanently. They knew deep inside that slavery was an ill.
Yeah, and I mean, in this, Alexander Stephens, just so everybody's clear, was the vice president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis was the president. The vice president was Alexander Stephens, and so this is you can look at the contemporary writings, but also this isn't just when you look at the Confederacy. You can look at the conflicts that led up to the Civil War as well. And other conflicts in the United States. Like you've sometimes talked about the conflict between Missouri and Kansas, because we know that was a place where there were several compromises and like a lot of the things that were happening between the states in the run up to the Civil War reflected this simmering tension over whether slavery would expand, whether it would be kept into the states where it was. And this battle bubbled up. And I have to get your comments on this, because like I said, you've thrown it up to me. You've brought it up to me several times. So I don't want to be the one to talk about it, but just there's actual battle, an actual battle between, well, go ahead.
So let's go through the history, though, because it's very important. This is a part of our history most Americans don't appreciate, which is we were a country after the Revolution, but we were those 13 colonies, or 14 if you add Florida eventually. But it was after the Louisiana Purchase that you had now the ability to expand west. So what happens is you had northern states, and this was really the whites in those states who wanted to expand west for exactly what we all know the history of expansion west was: land, resources, all that kind of stuff. What happened was the southern planters, who had extreme power in the government because they had a minority rule situation with the 3/5 compromise clause, were expanding west as well. And so they were in Texas, for example, and we did a whole show on that, which caused the Mexican-American War. Then, like you're saying, there was a war between Kansas and Missouri because Kansas had put in their state constitution that slavery would be illegal. And this is a thing I think that is not well discussed. It's not because they were abolitionists who loved black people. They were tired of the planter class. They were actually like against oligarchy. And they didn't, because wherever you had slavery, you had extreme white poverty, because there was like no jobs for the white folks because you had unskilled labor.
Why pay a white person to do a job if you can just get slaves to do it? Exactly.
Correct. So you had unskilled labor in the field, but people don't talk. You had the skilled labor too, which, our governor tried to put in the thing that this is what benefited slaves. You had slaves that did very highly skilled work. So the planter class could rent those slaves out. So you had, if you wanted someone to be an architect or build a dam, there were slaves that could do all that. So there was no room for whites just to work. And so
Kansas, put this in their constitution.
Yep. And then what happens is Missouri did allow slavery. And what you had in one instance was 5,000 people snuck over from Missouri to Kansas to vote in one of their elections because they were trying to vote in state legislature that would change the constitution and, all that stuff. So it's a long story. But long story short, there was a war between
people who talk about that sounds like the people who talk about sneaking in people to vote. That's kind of a projection, I guess, because the people who snuck over to vote were the people that were pro-slavery.
Yeah. So, but then in the end, there was a war between Kansas and Missouri, and 10,000 people died in this war. And that's what I mean. Like this is, American history is pretty amazing, actually. And so this stuff was all going on as well prior to the Civil War. And there was also a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was an elite group behind the scenes, also trying to dismantle the Union and create basically a slave-holding area that included Cuba and Mexico and other parts of the Americas. So, basically you had a lot going on.
And so that's about, like whether slavery can expand, and this is like a couple of years before the Civil War. Like this is not like something completely remote. And so when you look at the overall arc of the history, like this was simmering, the expansion and the continued existence. Many in the South believed that slavery didn't expand and eventually it would get rooted out. And that was kind of they looked at it not just from the economic standpoint, but as something that in order to preserve the existence of the institution, it had to expand. And so this really was a fundamental piece of the first 70 or 80 years of the history, 60, 70, 80 years of the history of the United States. And so to try to boil it down and to look at, yes, there were other things that people argued about at those times. You're looking at, if you throw a percentage on, it's like 80 or 90% about the institution of slavery and the expansion of it and the nature of the economies in the places where the United States is expanding. And yes, that affected the economics, or yes, that affected this and that. And so what we're seeing with these efforts in modern times and what the Daughters of the Confederacy did and so forth is either making up stuff or saying, okay, let's look at these smaller factors that basically were resultant things as a result of the fights over slavery. Again, the economics weren't about the economics. The economics were about what happens whether you go for a slavery-based economy or not. And make it about that. And again, it must be because the only reason I can think why you would do that was because if you lay down, draw the line in the sand that this is about slavery, is that you just don't think that people will look at it in a favorable way, or enough people will look at it in a favorable way. And you want people to look at it in a favorable way, understanding that once you can get people to choose sides, and if you can get them to take a side on it, then maybe at that point they can go all in for the other stuff as well. So, but I mean, I think that we have to be careful with when we do this type of thing, because oftentimes, and if you look at through history, what you'll see is when these types of histories are obscured or whatever, what you end up doing is setting the stage for another fight, to fight the same fight again, And so the concern I have, and the reason I bring this up today is because if we're going to take all these efforts to obscure the nature of the fights over what type of country this would be, is this going to be a country where there's a level of equality? Are we going to move towards equality? Are we going to move toward or try to either restore or go towards more of a hierarchical system where there are certain classes of citizens and, caste system or whatever you want to call it, or not? And the battles that we'll end up fighting those battles again. And whether it be through rhetoric, whether it be through voting, or in the case of the Civil War or the war between Kansas and Missouri, actual gunfights. And so the way to learn from these things that happened in the past is to know about them and know about them honestly, not know about how you think it'll make people feel good or something like that.
You know, but my analogy would be like if someone who's of Japanese descent living in America was like really having an argument with me that the bombing of Pearl Harbor was not the main reason why the United States entered the war. And they try to bring up all these other quotes and stuff like that and just try to say, look, that the fact that Pearl Harbor was bombed really wasn't the catalyst for this and all this. Like,
and it would have happened anyway. Like the U.S. would have joined anyway in the future. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe all that's true.
Yeah, it's like, okay, like you can believe that, but
but it was the next day. Says, it just happened to be the next day.
We declared war on them. Yeah, exactly. So. Yeah, I think
that
Pearl
was
Harbor
the line
had
in the sand, basically. You can play all the hypotheticals out and everything like that, but that was clearly the line in the sand based on what everybody said at the time. And again, you're much more reliable looking at what people said at the time than you are
and it's also
formulating stuff in their mind. But we do got to get out
Japanese,
of this.
Well, I just want to say this, that a Japanese American should not be offended by someone stating that fact, right? And I'm thinking like, I don't know why certain Americans are offended today, like you say, 150 years later, that we just state facts that were verbalized at the time of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, the curious part.
Yeah. So, yeah, for sure.
I know we got to go.
All right. Well, yeah. Well, thank you for joining us on part 2 of this discussion. Please definitely check out part 1 and also join us for part 3 as well.